Hi class, welcome back for the second part of lecture today. So we talked a little bit about the divisions of life on the tree of life for the first part. And what we discussed there was that a large fraction of the life on Earth is microbial, is singular cellular type life. Even macroscopic life is based on individual cells. And so all of the functions that make life life, that long list of categories we made last lecture of activities that are necessary but not sufficient for something to be alive, are all carried out at the cellular level. And so we're going to talk about some of those cellular activities. And in particular today, what we want to talk about is what we're calling metabolism. Okay, so in the background there is a micrograph of a leaf. You can see the individual cells in a leaf, and those kind of green structures that you see there are called chloroplasts. The chloroplasts are involved in the photosynthetic harvesting of sunlight, which is what plants use as an energy source. And we'll talk about the input of energy into life forms during this segment of the lecture. Okay, so let me go ahead and start some slides here. So ultimately, the source of all energy for life on Earth is really the sun. In almost all instances, life on Earth is either harvesting light from the sun or we are eating other life forms to get energy, but they have ultimately got their energy from the sun. One might argue that there are some forms of life that derive energy from chemical processes, but even there, as an astronomer, I would argue that the energy ultimately came from the sun because the sun is responsible for the collection and assembly of the planets and all the minerals and all the inorganic chemicals that make up the world. So as an astronomer, the kind of global viewpoint that I take is that all energy that life uses on planet Earth comes from the sun. And we'll come back to that question a little bit later in the quarter when we talk about life on other worlds. But let's talk about the metabolic operations of life. So what we'll do is we'll define what a few life processes are. We'll focus most of our attention today on energy and raw materials. And then we'll talk a little bit about how we classify life based on the way they use energy or the way they gather energy and the way they use raw materials to go about their lifey business. Okay? So in our definition of life, we had three really important elements. There were six total elements, you'll recall. But the three elements that I think are kind of relevant to our discussion today is we said life utilizes energy to do its lifey business. Life reproduces itself, that is, organisms make copies of themselves, and life evolves and adapts in response to its environment, okay? So we won't get to that last point, but we're setting ourselves up to talk about that point when we talk about DNA next lecture. Okay, now all of these functions are encoded by the function and operations of the molecular machinery that's built into the structure and operation of the cells that make up whatever life form you're talking about, whether it's a complex multicellular organism like a plant or an animal, or an individual singular cellular life form. Okay, so all of the operations that identify something as being alive are contained in the various functionings of the cell. And so the question is, how does that molecular machinery get put together, and how does that molecular machinery operate? Okay, the chemical processes that go on inside the cells, right? The machinery that's doing stuff with the chemicals and materials that it finds in its environment, the stuff that life does, as we say, are broadly what we call metabolism. Okay, and so there are basically three things you need for a cell to have metabolic function. There need to be raw materials for it to operate on. That's because it needs raw materials either to make copies of itself, to produce the things that cells need to produce to operate, to do whatever it is it needs to do. So it has to have raw materials. It needs to have some form of energy. And we're going to talk about energy on two different levels. There has to be energy coming from the outside that the cell gathers and utilizes, but then it needs to store energy and use energy for its day-to-day operations, okay? And so we'll talk about both of those. And then the last thing it needs is it needs catalysts to actually make all the things happen. You can think of catalysts as basically the smaller parts of the machine that make the cellular operations happen. We're not going to talk about those much this class, but we'll come back to them over and over again. So these are basically, those of you who know something about biology, these are the things called enzymes. And there are many different enzymes in cellular processes, and the cells know how to make them. It's part of what's encoded into the diagnostic information that the cell carries around with itself about how to, the instruction book about how to do things, okay? So we'll talk about those a little bit in a future lecture, but they're part of the game here when we talk about metabolic processing. Okay, so let's talk about raw materials. So fundamentally, for all life on Earth, the raw material that matters is carbon. We are, as we say, carbon-based life forms. Carbon is an exquisitely versatile atom because it has many opportunities for it to form bond structures with other atoms in the universe. And those bonds, those four possible bonds that it can make, allow for an extremely diverse set of possible structures that can be built out of one or more carbon atoms. So what I have here on the right is a figure that's in your textbook showing different kinds of carbon chains. And so the skeletons of carbons are typically long chains of carbons in a row. They can also have branching structures, as you can see there. They can also have single or double bonds, as you can see in places where you have two lines. Those are so-called double bonds. Double bonds give the structures that are built out of these carbon chains a lot of strength. They can vary in location, and they can also vary in angle, which give the molecules very different shapes, which allow them to do very different things depending on how they're utilized inside a cell. Okay, so these complex structures are built very simply out of just a few different molecules. Carbon-based molecules that are associated with life are what we usually call organic molecules. And there's a huge diversity of organic molecules that are just based on all the different myriad ways you can put carbon together. There are a finite number of ways that you can put a finite number of carbon atoms together. So you can sit down and play around with how many different ways can I connect 3 carbon atoms that have 4 bonds each, but you can make as many different organic molecules you want by extending those carbon chains in great length in any direction. Okay, so in terms of cellular processes, in terms of metabolism, what really matters is where does the life form get its carbon from? Okay, and so there's basically 2 ways for that life on Earth gathers carbon. One is through food, eating other carbon-based life forms. That's what you and I do. And then the other way is by gathering and processing carbon dioxide. Okay, and that's basically what plants do. Okay, so if you're going to use carbon, the question is, what are you going to do with it? So typically what plants are doing, or what any life form is doing, is it's taking the carbon, raw carbon it finds in its environment, and it's using it to build structures, okay? So in the case of you and I, all of our skin and our flesh and our bones and all the cells in our body are based on carbon, and our body takes the processed carbon and it creates all the cells in our body from that. Similarly for plants, plants harvest carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and it produces all the things that the plants are made of: leaves, branches, and the whole 9 yards. Okay, so this is why when we talk about climate change, and we'll come back to climate change later in the quarter, plants themselves are, as we say, a carbon sink. They harvest carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, they put it into their bodies, into their plant material, the trunks of trees and their leaves on their branches, and they bind the carbon out of the atmosphere, okay? And the way they do that is they gather it and then use it to produce themselves. Okay, now that production, that manipulation of carbon and turning it into the stuff that you're made of takes energy. And so the question is, where does the energy come from? The energy processing in all cells is based universally on Earth on a complex molecule known as ATP. Okay, so that's an abbreviation for adenosine triphosphate. Okay, if you say ATP, everyone's going to assume that you're talking about this. Okay, unless you're talking to someone from NASA, in which case ATP means Astrophysics Theory Program. Okay, but in molecular biology, it means adenosine triphosphate. So I've drawn the molecular structure of adenosine triphosphate down there, and I've labeled in colors where the name comes from. So that complex structure on the right side that has the nitrogens, and the oxygens in it is the part that's called adenosine. And adenosine binds through a long chain out the left side there to a variety of things. And here it binds to 3 phosphates. Okay, so the 3 phosphates groups are indicated by the orange squares. Okay, so this is adenosine triphosphate because there are 3 phosphates on the side. Okay, now that last phosphate group hanging out on the left there, there's a lot of energy stored in that intermediate bond between the middle phosphate group and the tail end phosphate group. So this is a way for cells to store energy. They keep a lot of ATP stored up in the cell. It's kind of like, it's a chemical storage of energy. It's like what's in a battery that you stick into the remote control for your TV set, right? Energy is chemically stored in that battery. Okay, well, this is a way for cells to chemically store energy in the form of adenosine triphosphate. The way it gets the energy out is it looks at that little tail end phosphate group that's hanging out on the end. And if you were to break that bond, so you take that last phosphate group and you break it off, then a amount of energy is released, and the cell can grab onto that energy and use that energy for whatever lifey purpose it needs it for. The consequence of breaking that is you're left behind with something that is now adenosine plus 2 phosphates. So that's called ADP, adenosine diphosphate. Okay, and then it just floats around in the cell. Similarly, that phosphate group that was broken off also kind of floats around in the cell. So what you have happening is when you break apart the ATP, you end up with the raw materials to make ATP again if you could somehow rebond that phosphorus back to the adenosine diphosphate, okay? So it's a little bit weird to think about breaking bonds because when you and I think about breaking something, we know it takes energy to break something. And that is certainly true in the case of chemical bonds as well. You have to put energy in to break in that bond. And so the question is, well, if I have to put energy in, how do I get energy out? And the point is that the bond there, it doesn't take as much energy to break it, to rip that phosphate group off, as is stored in the bond itself. So one of the ways I often think about this is to imagine I have a balsa wood airplane with a rubber band propeller, okay? I can spend a ton of energy winding the propeller up, okay, and storing energy in that wound up rubber band, okay? So when I get that rubber band all wound up, I'm still holding on to the propeller, okay? And I've spent enormous amounts of energy winding up all the energy in that propeller's rubber band. It only takes a little tiny bit of energy to open up my finger and let the propeller go. And when I do that, all the pent up energy stored in that rubber band gets released. Okay, so that's kind of the same thing that's going on here, right? There's a whole bunch of energy that's invested in making the bond that makes the ATP, but it only takes a little bit of energy to cause the bond to release and then release all of the energy that's stored in the bond, okay? And so the cell uses that released energy for all of its lifey purposes, okay? So just as we were just discussing, you have to be able to recycle to make ATP within the cell. So you take loose phosphate, that's one of the raw materials for ATP. You take loose adenosine diphosphate, ADP, which is the other raw material. And using energy that's coming in, you reformulate that bond between the loose phosphates group and the ADP, and you create ATP, and you've basically stored energy for future use. Okay, so you take all of that external energy, you store it in that bond, and then you just have your ATP floating around to use when you need it. That's the whole nature of energy storage. Okay, so the question then is, how do organisms gather energy? It's really that energy input that we use to differentiate organisms, because all organisms use this ATP mechanism to release energy once their lifey processes inside the cell are going on. So the question is, how do they actually get the energy from the outside? Okay? So we classify metabolic processes based on these two properties then. Basically, how do they get their external energy, and then how do they get their carbon? okay? So in terms of external energy, there's basically two ways that you get external energy in life on Earth. One is through what we'll call chemical energy, okay? And then one is basically solar energy from light, okay? Similarly, there's basically two ways you get carbon, okay? So one way is you get carbon from other life forms, okay? So if you get your energy from other life forms, we call you if you get your carbon from other life forms, we call you a heterotroph. So troph means to harvest or to eat, and hetero means others, okay? So you get your carbon by eating others. You eat carrots, you get energy from carrots. You eat a steak, you get energy from the steak, okay? Sorry, you eat carrots, you get carbon from the carrots. You eat steak, you get carbon from the steak, okay? The other classification is an autotroph. So an autotroph is a self-harvester. And so in this case, you have organisms which are basically harvesting the raw materials, harvesting carbon, not from other life forms, but from their environment. And so this is basically what plants do. Plants harvest carbon from the free-floating carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, okay? So you basically see here, I've drawn a grid, okay, and this is shown as a table in your textbook, but I think the grid's a little bit easier, at least for me, to kind of keep things in my head. So if you like the table, you can certainly look at the table in the textbook, but some of you may find this a convenient way to think about the cross-correlation of how you get energy and how you get carbon. Okay, so what are the different types? So you basically combine the names. So there are chemoautotrophs. So chemoautotrophs get their carbon from carbon dioxide, they're autotrophs, and they get their energy from chemical energy. And the chemoautotrophs get their energy from inorganic chemical processes, okay? So the kinds of creatures that we see doing this in the Earth's ecosystem are bacteria and archaea, especially in extreme environments. And we're going to talk about extremophiles here in a near future lecture. Okay, so this is you know, like getting energy by breaking down weird chemicals or things like that. The next ones are called chemoheterotrophs. Okay, so these are organisms that get their carbon by eating other organisms, and they get their energy by breaking down organic compounds. Okay, so that includes animals. Animals eat grass or they eat other animals, and it also includes many microbes. Okay. The fourth category are what are called photoautotrophs. So these are creatures, organisms that get their carbon dioxide, get their carbon from the environment, and they get their energy from sunlight. Okay, so this is the plants. The plants harvest sunlight, and they get their carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And there are also a whole class of bacteria that photosynthesize. So these are called photosynthetic bacteria. And then the last group, if you've been combining the names, are photoheterotrophs. Okay, so these are getting their carbon by consuming other creatures, other organisms, but they're getting their energy from sunlight. And there's a whole class of bacteria and archaea that actually do this. Okay, so when you look at this chart here, what you'll notice is that the bacteria, the microbes, show up in every possible combination. Okay, so the microbial life is extraordinarily versatile. And this is really one of the key lessons we learn from looking at life on Earth, is that of all the life forms on Earth, the most versatile, the most adaptable, the most prevalent, because you can find it in virtually every environment using virtually every source of energy you can imagine and every source of carbon you can imagine, are the microbes. They have adapted and set themselves up to use the resources that they can find in virtually every environment on Earth. And so as a consequence, that heavily shapes our thinking when we think about looking for life elsewhere in the cosmos. This is why when you talk to, you know, your favorite NASA astrobiologists and they are talking about searching for life elsewhere in the solar system, they really think very often in terms of looking for microbial life, not looking for big complex life forms like you and I. Okay, we will talk about looking for big complex life forms when we talk about the search for extraterrestrial intelligence at the end of the quarter, but this is why most of our attention in astrobiology is focused on microbes, is because when we look at life here on Earth, it's really the microbes that are dominant, okay, and the most versatile. Okay? Okay, so that is all I'm going to say for this lecture. I hope you are doing okay and keeping up with your reading. If you certainly have any questions, please do let us know. We'll see you in office hours, or we'll see you on the campus discussion boards. Okay? Take care, everybody. We'll talk to you soon.